Everyone, thanks for staying here and not getting too caught up in the coffees and teas and cakes. Today we have a very interesting panel covering technology applications and innovation for nature-based carbon projects. I'm John Pierre from Geotree. We use remote sensing, AI, and biogeochemical modeling to provide analytics for carbon projects, not just MRV during the life cycle of the project, but also de-risking early-stage development via carbon potential analysis, leakage analysis, and dynamic baselines. Anyway, I'll give the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves, and then we will dive straight into what should be quite an interesting discussion for people across the entire supply chain, whether it's project developers, standard agencies, crypto enthusiasts, and also remote sensing companies. So, Anil, I'll let you start with the introductions.
Wonderful. Thanks, John. My name is Anil Madhubi. I'm a professor in computer science at Cambridge University. And about 2 years ago, I got involved with setting up a new center with my colleagues in the Conservation Institute with a very simple focus. The University of Cambridge itself wanted to offset all of its necessary emissions, and essentially had no idea how to go about it. There was a very complicated set of carbon markets that we could get involved in, and we weren't satisfied with the state of the art in verification and monitoring to know that our money was going into something that we could justify. And so I set up the Cambridge Center for Carbon Credits with several colleagues from plant sciences and ecology, with a view to look at the entire end-to-end supply chain for how organizations should be purchasing and consuming offsets. So starting from the beginning, looking into how do we increase the supply, particularly with the focus on deforestation and biodiversity-friendly projects. How do we verify those on an ongoing basis so we know that our money is going towards credible projects using a combination of remote sensing technologies and other MRV techniques. And then also how do we ensure that our internal markets for purchasing it are making sure that these offsets go towards responsible activities that cannot otherwise be decarbonized, which is obviously very complicated in a large university such as Cambridge. And so everything we're doing is open source code. We're obviously a university, so we're publishing all of our techniques. And we're hoping that as we establish this template, we can release that more openly and start a discussion around how we could scale the supply of particularly of deforestation by several orders of magnitude so we can meet our emissions goals.
Thanks, Anil. Rachel?
Good afternoon, Rachel Nutter. So I'm the Director for Carbon Project Development at Climate Impact Partners, which was formed from the merger last year of Climate Care and Natural Capital Partners, two companies that have been in the carbon markets for about the last 20 years, so everybody knew each other. We work with corporate and investor clients, helping them to meet their carbon neutral and net zero goals, typically over increasingly lengthy time periods. And so we do that through two different routes. One, we pull together increasingly sophisticated portfolios of projects that are operating today across nature-based solutions and energy, household devices, etc. And really trying to meet their goals over increasing time periods. As I say, they've usually got preferences for different geographies, different types of technology, etc., and they always have a budget, of course. But the second part of the portfolio that we're building and managing for those clients, and is the sort of real growth part of our business now, is new project development and funding. We're bringing that funding and project development expertise to projects over, potentially 25 years or so in return for the carbon credits from those projects. And so I'm extremely interested in any technology that can help me to design projects better and mitigate the risks over fairly lengthy periods.
Thank you, Rachel. Owen?
Yeah, hi everyone. Owen Hewlett. I'm the Chief Technical Officer at the Gold Standard Foundation, which is a Swiss non-profit that focuses on high quality climate and sustainable development action for a variety of purposes, from carbon markets to Scope 3 to government action to investment funds. And similarly, really very interested in how we use technology to increase the quality and likelihood of success of projects and programs and portfolios, and also how we use it to help to allocate those benefits correctly for the correct purpose. So to us, on the one hand, it's quality of action. On the other hand, it's integrity of use. So how we use the tools, the financial instruments, and the impacts we generate for the right thing, for the right type of reporting in the right way to avoid greenwashing is very important to us. So really the full gamut, everything from risk-based tools to help with good design through to stuff that helps us with the monitoring, reporting, and verification, right into how we allocate and track those benefits correctly.
Thanks, Owen. Charlie?
Hi, everyone. I'm Charlie Poole from Toucan Protocol. And what we do at Toucan is we tokenize carbon credits. So we effectively take traditional carbon credits and create a digital twin of those and then put them on a blockchain. And the sort of mission and idea around why we do that is to build the infrastructure to help increase the size and the volume and ultimately the integrity of the carbon markets. My role there is I head up the commercial side of the business and I look at both the supply side of what projects and type of credits that we will bring on chain, and then also look at the demand side and the types of demand, whether they come from sort of Web3 blockchain type or more traditional corporate type, or the sort of emerging DeFi, decentralized finance type of demand. And we build products for those different audiences to build on top of.
Okay, great. Thanks, Charlie. So we have a lot of buzzwords here, right? High quality credits, DeFi, and the like. But I think let's not lose sight of the view of the project developer. So maybe, let's kick off with unpacking a bit, the life cycle of a carbon project. Maybe this is something, Rachel can help us with, and maybe Owen can also jump in here. But, let's start on that ground zero, so to speak.
Yeah, so we take projects really from as early as an idea and an early feasibility study, right the way through. There'll be a period where you actually go through more detailed design of that project, identifying eligible land areas, and importantly for us, really critical, identifying very competent and capable local implementation partners who are going to act to high codes of conduct that our clients and investors need. And often that might be, they can be companies who, it's highly fragmented. So, yes, there are companies who've done carbon projects before, but quite often you're working with local organisations who are brilliant on the ground, but they don't know anything about carbon. So it's really putting that carbon overlay onto it and helping them to design something that's going to be sustainable, not over, sort of 2 or 3 years, but over 20 years, over 30 years, and so on. So really designing the activities on the ground and how everybody's going to be correctly incentivised over a long period. And then often in that time period where you're doing the design, very often you're already starting some of the on-ground activities, community consultations, etc., perhaps doing some early planting and so on, and really understanding how you're going to do the project. Then you go through the period with the standards of independent verification, independent audit, site visits, etc. Project gets validated. That's how you're going to do the project. And then later on, you carry on the monitoring your activities. And then at a certain point, you can choose whenever you want to do a verification. Again, independently audited, independently verified. Then it goes through the standard. Then you get your credits. It sounds so simple.
Yeah, I was just about to say. What role does the registry and the standards play in it? And is there a way we can try and simplify this process that Rachel has so succinctly described?
No, it's impossible. Well, I guess if you start at the other end of the pipe, what you end up with in the carbon markets anyway, to what Charlie was saying, is an emission reduction or removal credit in a registry. So if you reverse engineer that back through the process that Rachel just said, it's all about a combination of data coming together to realize that metric so that you can use it for different purposes. And of course, you can't generally measure greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere at such a localized level. So there isn't really a project type where you could put a meter in the ground and say this much greenhouse gas emissions has been emitted and it's less than it was before. So what you have is a series of parameters varying in complexity by project type that are a proxy and add up to, through things that look like physics equations, to an emission reduction metric. So if you're in forestry, it might be a tree census coupled with validated data sets. If it's clean cooking, it's going to be user surveys coupled with measurements of wood use, that kind of thing. And with all of those things, there is a complex construct behind it to add up, or I guess add down, to an emission reduction. So the more we can do to make that data collection, analysis, correlation reporting easier, the easier it is to realize that final metric and therefore the carbon credit. I think the other thing that what comes across in what Rachel shared is it's not just the complexity of how many metrics they are and what to measure, it's that needs to be done over a period of time. And what happens is you get to the end of that time and then you do your calculation and then you issue an emission reduction. Actually, what would be a lot better is if we could be doing that calculation in real time or as close to real time as possible. It might not always be real time, but you can imagine for some project types, the calculation could just be constantly running. So can we spike that, if you like, and reduce the time frame and increase the value of the credits because they become kind of freshly issued in real time?
Anil, do you want to add to that?
It's a really good segue into what we're doing at Cambridge, because we we had to select 10 different projects in order to figure out where do we begin with our offsetting journey. And one of the really nice things about having remote sensing is that we can actually cross-check the original claims of the project by looking into very quantitative data that is available freely. And we've had a lot of success with just generating independently analyses of the additionality of a project against counterfactuals. We're adjusting for permanence based on expected events that will happen in the future, and then those credits become naturally more valuable as time goes on, which is counter to the conventional thinking that vintage credits should get cheaper. But in fact, if you have a forestry protection project, then you know that if something happened in 2014 and that forest is still around, then those avoided emissions have had multiplicatively less damage to the atmosphere as time goes on. So paradoxically, we're finding that we value older credits that we've really checked and cross-checked much more than you might expect for many other projects. So it is entirely possible, I think, to reduce the cost significantly of constructing these projects by starting with a narrative and then using and building and incorporating quantitative techniques, not to replace the entire life cycle, which is tremendously complicated, but purely just to check some of those equations and make sure that the basic numbers around carbon avoidance are in the right ballpark.
And I'll just add to what Anil was saying. I think it's a really exciting time to be in the remote sensing space. We have so many new satellites going up, new sensor capabilities, hyperspectral. We have spaceborne LiDAR, which we started to incorporate to look at things like tree canopy height. So I think from that end of the spectrum, we have a lot of solutions which are coming down the road. But the question always is, and similarly to blockchain, I think David Horn from Shell pointed the question yesterday, are we a solution looking for a problem, right? So maybe we can unpack a bit the main problems that people like Rachel, who are the developers, see. And then I think, Charlie, we need to jump into Toucan, which is a whole interesting space to get into. But maybe, Rachel, you can give us the clear outline of the main problems you see as a project developer.
Yeah, I mean, there are many problems that are not addressed by technology as well, which is just capacity and capability on the ground, the time, the complexity of dealing with local land law, with national carbon law, which is quite often fairly opaque or just doesn't even exist. So leaving aside some of those complexities, but from a technical perspective, we're looking at a number of different technologies and trialing them on various projects at the moment to see how we think that remote technologies are going to be able to help us at all stages of project life. Verification is kind of this end goal. It would be really nice to be able to turn off effectively working capital to a project at a certain point. But that's, there's work to be done between the developers and the standards, and that's ongoing. We'll sort it. But even at the very early stages, when we're doing due diligence, when we're looking at, is this land eligible? Has this local partner, what's the history been of growing this species in this region? And we can go back and have a look at this. How successful has the pilot stage been without having to go to the other side of the world and go on a site visit and not access the whole site anyway, through to, once we actually start planting, for example. So a lot of the project development demand is in afforestation, reforestation, revegetation. that's quite high risk. You've spent all your money up front planting and looking after the trees a long time before the carbon comes. So as an investment risk profile, attractive when the credits come, but there's a lot of risk up front. And you don't want things to go off track too far before you take action. So, we really see that remote sensing can help us. We want to know, how big does a sapling have to be for us to see whether it is thriving? How quickly is it growing? What can I see what's been planted, where it's planted? And then from a digital perspective, just on the ground, tracking, being able to say this farmer planted this many trees in this location, and really having a robust data chain and trying to get rid of anything paper-based. Because where we've got digital projects, we get the data like that. Paper projects, it's months before you actually know what's going on. So just from a practical perspective, being able to take action much earlier if things are not on track, that's incredibly valuable for us.
No, thanks for that, Rachel. So, Charlie, I think it's worth giving the audience a bit of a picture, if you can, of the scale of what Toucan has done thus far, and also, what problem are you solving?
Yeah. Okay. So I think to take that in reverse, when I first started in carbon in around 2006, we had all sorts of problems going through the project lifecycle, just as Rachel described. But you'd have all that sort of project financing risk, not knowing where your money was actually going necessarily. You had a whole load of intermediaries which could be taking margin, and you didn't know whether you could trust them. And then you had, like, at the sales end, like, people selling or double selling credits and all sorts of, like, funny business going on. And what potentially, and I'm not saying we've solved these problems by any means, just at the start of it, a lot of these problems can be resolved by digitizing the credits so that you are able to track them better, organize, search, filter, all the things that you come to be expecting of digitization and software. And particularly on putting them onto a blockchain, which is sort of known for the transfer of both value and data, and has these other attributes such as being transparent or permissionless, trustless, immutable, so it cannot be tampered with and changed, to show that, like in this case, the provenance and the history of the credit, and where it ties into what Rachel was saying. It becomes very exciting that in the future, these digital versions of the credits, it won't be long before you are able to go as a potential buyer or seller or someone in the market, be able to click on a link, you see every trading history of a credit, you'll be able to know that you can buy it from someone knowing that they actually do own it and have all that sort of trust removed from it. But then you'll also be able to click into all the project history, the verification, reporting, and if it's digital reporting, you may even be able to see that reporting happening in real time, depending on the methodology that it is. So there's all this potential there that comes from the digitization of the credit. And what we do at Toucan is just the digitization of the credit. We don't sell them or buy them or anything like that. It's just a pure software infrastructure layer. But we launched in October last year, and in the first 6 months, we bought just over 20 million tons on chain. And to sort of give an idea of how big that is, that's about 5% of the entire market done in 6 months. So it was a sort of a huge boom as it launched. And I think it sort of proved that the market was there for this sort of technology to be brought in.
Well, it certainly sounds like a big volume in a short space of time. And as a former agriculture trader myself who's traded corn and wheat, I could totally get the argument that carbon is probably a more digitally native commodity, so to speak, living on a ledger. But, maybe, Anil, have we seen any issues thus far in terms of how this kind of bridging technology and connecting to retail investors or whatever has been, perceived?
It's a good question. It's with many things in technology, you have to have a demonstrator and then a prototype, and then you learn from failure and you keep iterating rapidly. So this works pretty well for pure technology plays, but when it comes to projects that are lasting for decades, you have to obviously be extraordinarily careful. One of the things that I think Toucan pioneered was this idea of taking an existing credit registry and putting it on chain. But then one of the problems we've observed when trying to figure out, do we use this technique or not, is that this is middleware. So you only have a partial snapshot of the project. So you've got this very complicated project development lifecycle, as both Rachel and Owen described. And then you also have the problem of retirement afterwards as well. So saying, what are you actually going to do with these digitized carbon credits? So if you're going to retire them for a purpose that is not essentially a necessary emission, then you're greenwashing, right? Because you can have big companies and corporations expending and claiming these offsets for purposes that are not essential, and then decrediting the entire scheme and philosophy behind carbon offsets. I think that's happened a lot in the blockchain world because often what we've been doing on the blockchains is to offset energy expensive blockchain operations. But the technology exists to decarbonize those blockchains. So a counter argument for what we should be doing is that we should be focusing all of the carbon finance and the retirements of blockchain transactions on making sure that these blockchains become less energy efficient. We know the technology path to it, but quite often it's the easy path is to offset the transactions. So there's examples on both sides where the lack of transparency on the supply side means that you have a bit of an impedance mismatch. And then the lack of visibility into where it's being offset also leads to a lack of credibility. So for our offsets, we're really trying to, it's very hard to build a global solution that is transparent and scalable simultaneously. So our solution is to try, within one organization, building that template where we can really over-invest in understanding the project supply, so cross-checking gold standard standards and the project developer claims by using remote sensing, but also keeping a hold on the credits to make sure that we can control the output and where the retirement happens. So this doesn't scale just yet, but it solves the problem from a slightly different dimension, I think. So hopefully we can learn from all these approaches and see which one works in the long term without wasting too much time.
Charlie?
Yeah, and as Toucan, we can definitely hold our hand up and take responsibility for a lot of those cheap credits coming into the market.
So Charlie, just before, can you just explain a bit this whole concept of zombie credits, which I think kind of came out.
Yeah.
I'm sure everyone knows. Maybe very quickly you can just touch on that.
So when we launched with a partner on the demand side, which was a thing called a DAO, a decentralized autonomous organization, which their stated purpose was to buy up all the cheap carbon credits in order to remove them from the market so that the price went up and we got rid of the poor quality credits. And so they created this product and immediately it went within 2 weeks of launching, its market cap went from zero to over $1 billion. So it was this huge explosion and generated a huge amount of demand. But what that did is, for the first time, created a visible, real-time price for voluntary credits. So, because it had liquidity, as opposed to these credits that are traditionally priced OTC. So, because there was a price, what that meant was a lot of emission reduction projects that had happened in the past but hadn't bothered to go through the verification process because of the cost of it, and they weren't sure if they were going to get the credits in the first place, suddenly saw an exit route. And so that awakened those projects. And so, to use the zombie terminology, they were sort of dormant and then rose from the dead out of nowhere. And what that really meant was this product was basically where I said that they were trying to sweep out all the cheap credits. What really, it was like a bath where they tried to pull the plug, but at the same time turned the tap on, and so it just keeps filling up. And so that has been an issue in the market recently.
That's a great analogy, actually. So Owen, C-Token, Climate Out, all these guys came in, Q4 last year, a lot of interest, excitement, hype. What's the view of CTO in a kind of what's called TradFi from a carbon perspective? So the traditional organizations, how do you kind of view this kind of innovation and how it could potentially plug into what you are doing currently?
Yeah, it was interesting. We weren't part of the original zombie explosion, and I think there's lots to say here. I guess one thing is the hype makes an awful lot of noise that crowds out more important conversations. I'll give credit to Toucan for actually bothering to come and speak to us, which most of those players don't, which I find baffling because all of this could be avoided with a conversation with experienced people, right? You would never do that in any other kind of investment instrument, just not speak to the market you were working with. So credit to Toucan for actually doing that. I think the second thing we would say is that we see it as a tool. It's a bit unfair, but it's like getting excited about an electric screwdriver, right? Like the job we have to do is still there to do. If this can help us do it better, so be it. But it shouldn't be crowding out the job that we have to do. I think the other things that we've been thinking about is I think the use cases that Toucan are looking at are great. I think there's much more interesting use cases to come. I think there's very interesting use cases around. You guys have this fragmentation tool which allows you to break a carbon credit down into 1/100th and then add it back up to 100 constituent parts. Now, if you took a science-aligned cross-section of projects evolving between now and 2040, and it was made up of the most optimal things that a company should invest in at any given time, then that percentage will change. Right? Maybe right now it's 20% methane and whatever. Over time, that will evolve. That fragmentation principle could administer that whole thing, which I think is really interesting. Another would be, I think, and this is a longer-term evolution, carbon credits are a relatively straightforward instrument. They're a single metric, single claim for one compensatory purpose. But when you get into things like supply chain inventory accounting, you might have multiple companies reporting the same liability. I think where blockchain can really help us then is when we get into digital twinning of things like food systems or digital twinning of supply chains. So you can start to allocate those things, those liabilities and those benefits much more accurately. So I think Anil put it perfectly. As a beachhead to something much more interesting, I think is really exciting. We actually have a tokenization working group coming up. I think the biggest thing to us was the governance, right? As Charlie said, like they originally started by retiring a credit and then continuing to trade it on chain. When if you retire a credit, it's done, right? It's claimed. So to us, immediately our terms and conditions and governance are breached because that ironically becomes a double use, which is exactly what it was trying to avoid. Now that kind of thing is very avoidable with the conversation. So again, like I say, we'll big credit to Toucan to reach out.
And Rachel, obviously this is kind of on the other side of the equation, more on the demand side, potentially unlocking the market to retail. Has it kind of impacted and filtered into, solving some of your issues, or is it still fairly ancillary at this moment?
Yeah, we really focus, when we talk about, tokenization and blockchains, I always go back to what's the underlying project that is creating that asset and what is the quality of that project. And not all projects are equal. Some of them cost more money to do and have different co-benefits. They might have different SDG benefits, different biodiversity benefits, whatever it might be. And so I think it's kind of oversimplifying to say, to me, carbon is a long way from being a commodity. That 1 ton of carbon from here is the same as 1 ton of, yes, it's 1 ton of carbon, but the attributes around that are very different. And particularly what we see with our corporate and investor clients is, and where they're investing money, significant amounts of money into those projects over long time periods, they really want to know that their reputation is being protected, that things are being done to a really high integrity, way from an E and an S and a G perspective. We've got clients who, we're working on looking at digital DNA sampling and sort of in the field, not quite real time, but working with the local university to process it and looking at biodiversity measures, for example. And that has huge value. They're prepared to pay more for that. Because they can talk about it. It's all about the story that they're bringing around the carbon as well as the carbon. And so I think particularly from a project development point of view, we're kind of just so focused on the fundamentals of that underlying project that creates the carbon asset. And we haven't found a way yet to sort of capture the value. You know, there is value in all these things. At the moment, we see carbon as the value carrier. Clients will pay more for projects that have other attributes as well.
And I think it's good that you take us out of that carbon tunnel vision, right? Because you have now spoken about co-benefits, biodiversity, and applications of technology like eDNA potentially. And obviously remote sensing with all the sensors that are going up at the moment, that can also add an additional layer to biodiversity. I'm just wondering from, you know, especially from the standards perspective as well, how can we, you know, add these different layers like biodiversity and other cool benefits to, you know, the ecosystem? So that could be potentially monetized as well, leveraging all these different types of technology.
Yeah, it's really why we were founded. So our kind of mission really is to add sustainable development criteria originally to the carbon markets, and it's kind of, you know, grown into something which could do it from either angle now, I guess. So at a simple level, you know, we will have shortly digital SDG impact reporting tools. So adding those in a more efficient way to each individual project, considering which metrics to go for. But I think even more so, you know, as Rachel rightly said, carbon is the value carrier generally, because the applications of that metric are well known and well understood and mature. So, you know, you have science-based targets for inventory metrics, you have the carbon markets for the emission reduction removal metrics. We don't have that equivalent reporting infrastructure for something like water or biodiversity or adaptation, gender, none of those things. You know, there isn't science-based targets for those. There is, I mean, you can't offset those things anyway, right? Yeah. So those things need to be built alongside this, a greater, more holistic understanding of how we hold companies responsible for their impact in the world, and then we build these tools around it. And I think, you know, the exciting thing about the kind of beachheads into things like biodiversity, zero deforestation, these kind of next generation impacts beyond carbon is you can build them right off the bat with technology, as opposed to carbon, which has to catch up. I think, I mean, just one last interesting point I think on that is that, you know, we need to be really careful not to leave projects behind. So these are all fascinating technologies, but no use to anybody if you can't apply them in the field. So I think for us, you know, just to get really practical, we will allow for the use of digital technologies across the value chain without pulling the rug out on the analog version. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because as Anil said, like remote sensing is something that, you know, if I had 3 parameters to get to the same thing, remote sensing could just do away with all 3 and replace it with 1. Now, if the methodology says it's just 1 now, the people that had to do all 3 can't do it anymore. Right. So how do we make sure that we don't build a methodology that only a small proportion of project developers can use, I think is really important to us. So that's the other working group we've got running on governance. Yeah, you
guys have a lot of work going on.
We do. We love a working group.
So, Anil, anonymous user asked, you know, can you share more information on this standard that Cambridge University is developing?
Absolutely. I hesitate to call it a standard because obviously, if you have 10 standards and we launch a new one, we'll have 11 standards. So, what we're trying to do is actually build on exactly what Owen just described, which is we're laser focused on trying to increase the supply of projects right now. That's what the world needs. And so the question is, how do we do that? So we're trying to avoid just shuffling pawns around in existing projects and trying to have price arguments and price discovery, saying we want new projects. So then the problem becomes, how do we make sure that we can have an inclusive mechanism for applying progressive digital technologies? So we can take, for example, as a baseline from gold standard and look at what is the actual bottleneck end-to-end in constructing this project. And so we're trying to create it in such a way that our baselines, instead of being narrative, which are the expensive things because you have to send people out to the projects to do the development, can just begin by being quantitative. So we can begin by saying, draw a polygon of something around on a map, and then come up with additionality estimates, with permanence adjustments, with leakage calculations from supply chains, but enough to just put the project on the map very, very cheaply. And then apply digital technologies to categorize projects in three grounds. So the first one is biodiversity, which is to say just give it a rating initially on a global scale by stack ranking to say that based on various indices, this is how this project fits in. And so we're trying to have projects which are nothing to do with deforestation. So things like direct air capture and stuff have terrible biodiversity ratings, obviously, and deforestation has huge impacts. Secondly, it's about local livelihoods. So how do we apply digital technologies to give us a verification that there's a measurable outcome for the people who are being funded here, and that it's a reasonable percentage of the project. And this is incredibly hard to do from the project construction, as Rachel observed, from the land tenure usage, who should the money go to, who can it legally go to, and how much do you want to give away to local, essentially to local taxation regimes, all of which you want to have happen in a good balance. So the good thing is that there are digital technologies that are very, very undersung, which are making progress in this space. There's wonderful projects out of IIT, the IITs in India on social verification using carbon projects. A quick show of hands, how many people here have used iNaturalist or Seek? So it's a few people. It's a wonderful way of using machine learning on your mobile phones to build a crowdsourced sense of biodiversity. And there's tens of thousands of naturalists online who classify pictures for you. And the last one is social justice. So how do we work with local governments and local organizations to make sure that we're not supporting corruption? And so all of these things have to equally balance the digital technologies with existing analog mechanisms to move them forward. And if we can have that, all our techniques are doing, I hesitate to call it a standard at the moment, is to equally promote these in such a way that we can holistically end-to-end construct projects. And so support efforts such as Climate Clear's efforts to create new projects, and many of you have talked to here, but use technology as a means and not an end. The end is the increase of supply in a credible way over the next decade.
And we find it hard to believe that you'll have a time when you don't need anybody to ever go on the ground. Yeah, you're always going to need some ground truthing, and you need people from the landowners or the local community actually going into the site and having some sense of ownership. And part of the case is you provide jobs. So if you take out all of that monitoring, you've lost a lot of engagement. You've lost the on-the-ground presence where you pick up things that just something's not right. But you lose the employment as well, and skills training and so on.
I think
so it's a careful balance.
I think it's a really good point. When you think about it, if you're going to use a model-based approach or a validated data set, somebody went on site and collected data, or you wouldn't have the model in the first place. But it just wasn't your model. And I think as things stand, there's an awful lot of data collection that happens in academia, for example, and in the commercial world that's not done for this purpose. And then vice versa, we don't share our data very well in the other direction. So one big area for growth, I suspect, will be the open sourcing of useful data and the ability to quickly assess its equivalent so that we can all use it better. So at a standards level and a verification level, we have 2,500 projects, 85 countries. All of those projects historically, in the kind of TradFi spirit, are on PDF or Word or Excel. Right. So to try and compare them and to learn something as simple as will technology X in country Y work, even that level of understanding is challenging. But if we did all find a way through the good practices that Anil is working on, be able to format our data in a way that we can all use, so share it in a way we can all use, then and everything becomes intelligent, more intelligent. And we will still have to go to site, but we'll have to go to site less. I think that's the aim.
And I think, Charlie, we are seeing in the blockchain space people being paid to potentially, do validation. I think Open Forest Protocol and these kind of groups allow people to collect data and contribute to our collective knowledge about specific projects. Is that something that Toucan is also kind of looking at, or what's the next iteration for Toucan?
It's something we're seeing, but not instigating. We've definitely heard of organizations popping up to do this sort of thing. I think one of the things, and you'll definitely have a better view on this, is that as new methodologies or technologies come online, it's quite hard for the verifiers to keep up with all the different technologies that are coming online. And so some of these technologies, probably the most famous of which would be like direct air capture, which is mainly been bought up by Stripe, and they haven't required it to be verified. They've done their own due diligence, and they've decided to go straight to Climeworks or Carbon Engineering or whoever's doing the technology and buy straight off them. So that does sort of beg the question of what will happen next with lots of other technologies appear and people need to sell their credits.
I guess one of the pluses with the sort of engineered removals is you can usually stick a a meter or you can stick a sensor. You can measure stuff much more easily with a mechanical system.
And it only exists
as a
for that
former
purpose
engineer.
as well, right? Yeah,
It's measurable.
Yeah, it only exists for the purpose of carbon removal, whereas a forest, that's one of the things it can do for us. Yeah, so it's
Then you can see that sort of stuff scaling very quickly because there's, like you were saying, you'd always expect a person on the ground. With that, you don't, and therefore you open up the possibility of sort of real-time offsetting, and you can imagine a plane having some meter measuring its emissions as it's in flight, linked to a direct air capture with a stream of payments going across in real time.
Yeah, and I think for things like water, I mean, slightly off the forest and ag, but for things like clean water or cook stoves and so on, you can imagine that in the not too distant future, you could get to the point where you're doing monthly issuances and it's just working capital for the projects, which would be absolutely amazing.
Yeah. And potentially for nature-based solutions as well.
Yeah,
sure.
just actually doing the biomass, the practicalities, which you know more than I.
Cadence, which maybe we do. So anyway, I think it's time to open up for questions. So Hayley, if anyone has any questions, maybe put your hand up.
Yep, over here.
There's one over there. Yeah.
You've got one online as well, John.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Sarah Clausen. I'm with New Forest. You guys were all very articulate on the supply side integrity, especially you, Rachel. No offense to anyone, but it was really good. I just wondered if the panel had any thoughts on demand side integrity. You talked a little bit about this, Anil, but how do we monitor who's buying these credits, what they're using them for? It's something we come across quite often. Our investors are asking us for. Do we base that off Climate Action 100? Do we base that off Net Zero Alliance? Do they have to be signed up and articulate about the SBTIs? Just any thoughts that you had on the other side of the equation. Thank you.
Maybe
Happy to have a go.
Rachel, you can start with that.
I love it. That's a great question. I was going to pick up on your point, Anil, about greenwashing and so on. I think what we tend to find is that our clients who are investing heavily in offsetting and particularly in project development, these are massive. I mean, typically the big corporates are doing it. This is really serious money. This is board level decisions, etc. And they're all the scrutiny they put on what they are buying and what they're investing in is phenomenal, and as it should be. So we actually tend to find those that are doing this are really they up their game everywhere, and they're doing everything. So this is not a sort of trivial, quick and cheap way to get rid of your mess. Actually their degree of sophistication tends to be pretty high once they're doing this. So I would find them, they tend to be the reverse of the greenwashers.
Yeah. So Anil, you work with Cambridge University. Yeah. Obviously, things like permanence, I'm sure, from a Cambridge perspective, quite important. Yeah. What do you see from the demand side as well, kind of tying into the question?
There's a very high-level dichotomy that we observed, which is when you have a supply-constrained market and you have loads of demand, the natural response is to increase the price, right? And unfortunately, this means that people who are rich and who shouldn't otherwise be consuming these credits will naturally will corner that market. So we've been experimenting with just discriminatory selling. So don't sell to people unless you know exactly what they're using it for, and try to hold the price at a reasonable amount of value, and have it structured in such a way that the supply can then increase naturally. So this is very counter to any traditional market, because the price just really wants to go up, right? If people want this thing, and so it's crucial that we engage with people who want to consume offsets in a responsible way, and are willing to publicize and voluntarily observe the fact that this is part of an integrated decarbonization strategy. Now, at the university, it's very simple. It's a shame game, isn't it? Because it's a voluntary market, so we don't have to take part in it. And so if we do take part in it, we want to make sure that there is no reputational risk involved to the University of Cambridge. So 820 years, whatever it is these days, ran away from Oxford, and we want to make sure that anything that we do with these offsets that we consume is increasing our reputation. And so this means having a defensible strategy for saying that this is what the classes of necessary offsets we're into. So the first one we're going for are flight offsets for conference travel, for example, which is a huge amount of the energy expenditure. Then the second one will be energy expenditure within the university itself. And then the third one is also co-investment in making sure that the lands that Cambridge owns are responsibly managed. So we've had projects that we've come into that are over 100 years of afforestation that are on Cambridge-owned lands. And so this spectrum, every single one of those doesn't have to be high volume, but it has to be defensible. And then we can grow those responsibly over time without having to say that we're offsetting everything from day one. So it's that restriction of growth and making sure that we understand everything that we're putting a voluntary offset into is the immediate challenge. It's not a great answer for a high growth, high investment market, but I think it is what we need from carbon to make sure that we cause no harm in this space.
And Owen or Charlie, any thoughts on the demand side? How can we unpack who's actually buying these credits?
Yeah, I think I think that's a good definition of greenwashing, right? That is the difference between what you said you did and the action you took. And I think, the tools that we use need to add up to the claim that's being made. And we have this opportunity, I think, with carbon initially to bring some consistency and common practice to those claims, and therefore build a tool that is a market that is common to that claim. So when we talk about some of the attributes of a carbon credit, like permanence and additionality, they're not just random quality attributes. The sum of those attributes adds up to the ability to compensate an emission elsewhere, which you can't do if you don't have them. If you're non-additional, you didn't compensate. So I think on the one hand, normalizing that behavior is helpful. So we see that in the ICVCM initiative. I think on the other hand, we're seeing a greater understanding and a more holistic view of what it means to be a responsible company, in the sense that you have this kind of value chain abatement portion of your work. So the stuff that's in your inventory, the stuff that's in your footprint, measured in a certain way and reported in a certain way and reduced, aligned with science. And then we have this new kind of area of what the Science Based Targets Initiative called the beyond value chain responsibility and mitigation work. That still is to be defined, exactly what good practice is there. There's an assumption that just buying an offset is enough, but it isn't necessarily. Actually, it's a fairly arbitrary measure. And so we expect to see a lot of development there. And then with that civil society legitimacy and clarity, which will hopefully emerge in the coming months, we'll start to see much more reassurance to companies looking to buy, and also for the stakeholders looking to scrutinize them. So that it's very hard to criticize a company when there's no framework against which to judge their claim. I expect that to change.
So I've got the flashing lights, in my face for the past 5 minutes. So I think we're going to have to wrap up there. Thanks a lot to the panel. I think this has been a great conversation starter for sure. And it's tea time, right? Or am I allowed to say it? It is tea. You can go and have tea. Thank you very much.
Thank you.